Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Dave, and this is Patrick.
Hi there.
And today we'll be talking about design principles for maps. So we're really hoping we'll get right back to the basics. We'll talk about some of the fundamentals of design. So our presentation today is very pure, it's very basic. There's not too many flashy demos or animations to blow you away, but hopefully we can give you some insights in ways you can improve the design of your map and also the page around it. So as I said, my name's Dave, and I'm a JavaScript tamer. I'm one of the engineers on the Google Maps API down in Sydney. And this is Patrick, and honestly, I don't think anyone in the office knows what he does.
I'm a UX designer, user experience designer on Google Maps and lots of things on the local side of things. And thanks for the intro. We are two different eggs. I hurl things at him, and I say, is this technically possible? And he goes, no. But seriously, this picture isn't all that accurate. I've actually got the world's biggest zit, as of yesterday, on my nose, and I hope the camera catches it. And also, outrageous stress stains in our pit stains there. So just to make sure that it's all accurate and clear. I also wanted to mention two different eggs in that at Google, we're constantly trying to figure out nuances of who our users are. And when we're designing, we just don't design in a bubble. We actually conduct lots of usability research and trying to figure out, like, not just demographically who our users are, but what do they fundamentally want to get out of life and out of our products. I wanted to introduce a different set of users, and that's two different eggs here. I'm a triplet, which is odd. My brother and I are identical. My sister is obviously fraternal. So yeah, two eggs, one split. Yeah, you get the picture. And there is your biology lesson. But because we're genetically virtually the same, are we the same user? Are the three of us all going to interpret a map in the same way? Are we going to look at icons on the map and interpret them in exactly the same way? And the fundamental answer is no. Any experiences that we had between the ages of 4 or 17, puberty is ravaging, and then up until we were 40, we have all of these experiences. We all read different books, go to different websites, look at different TV programs, whatever. And they all have all of those stimuli have a fundamental impact on how we're going to interpret a map. However, ironically, our differences in vision and in eyesight might also contribute to how we interpret a map and so on. But the fundamental principles are still relatively the same. When we design, we were still trying to shave nanoseconds and milliseconds off of your processing time. We want to get you to the information as quickly as possible. So how can we fundamentally do that? And so I want to pose this question to you. What does this map say? It's kind of difficult to see. And so one could conduct a lot of usability tests and in-lab usability studies and so on. But one of the easiest ways, if you're integrating any type of information into your content, especially map content, is to squint. And look at that picture up there and intentionally try to blur it. And what do you see? You see snow. Snow is probably, that big blotch of white, is probably the most prominent thing on the map if you were to squint. And in squinting, there's a bit of obscuring happening and so on. But in actual fact, is the snow the most important element or most appropriately a prominent element on the map? And in this case, it isn't. This map is trying to show all of the spottings of Godzilla, Bigfoot, and Sasquatch in the western United States. In actual fact, if that's the message of my map, I should be trying to elevate those components. And the photographic information, that rich satellite information, satellite imagery in the background is too prominent, and it's competing too much with that information on the map. And that's one of the fundamental principles. And yes, it's common sense, but it's one that we are constantly asking all the time. And that is, what should the map be saying? So what are the foundational design principles in getting there? And fundamentally, it's crap. So it's designing with crap. I'm going to talk about things beyond crap, and Dave's going to pipe in about how we actually apply all of these rules. So what is crap exactly? And I don't take credit for crap. Robin Williams takes credit for crap. Robin Williams, not the comedian, but the wonderful author who wrote the Non-Designer's Design book back in 2003. And what she did was fundamentally break down the principles of design, really where design meets usability. And she had said, she pontificated this, she said that purpose of design is to communicate, to organize, and to attract. So nothing just, we don't create designs just to make them sit there and look pretty. There's a fundamental message that has to be conveyed in in anything that we design. We want, as much as possible, to guide the human eye through a space in a very, very appropriate way. And we often refer to this space that the human eye goes through as rivers of information. And those rivers tend to meander, and they tend to obscure, and they tend to pop out at you. How can we guide the eye to the place that we want users to go to most? And how do we maintain their attention? How can we avoid them from clicking away too soon before they found the information that they were looking for? So where does CRAP fit in? Well, CRAP stands for contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. And those, for me personally, are I really follow these rules as much as possible. On a map where you've got lots of unpredictable data, it's really, really hard to say, well, how do I introduce alignment when my data doesn't, I can't just say, all of these buildings on the street should be aligned. But in actual fact, there are ways of ensuring that you can get your users to the information in the right way. So let's start with contrast. One more time. There we go. Contrast is a pretty simple fundamental principle, and that is, if you've got different information types on the page, you want to make those different information types distinct from one another. And contrast, whether it be through color, through stroke, through weight, through saturation or tone, those things will help make things, contrast different elements from one another. So you'll look at this map, and you've got primary roads, you've got secondary roads, you've got information off the map, and you'll also notice, hopefully you notice that this was a very, very, very old map of an old screenshot of Google Maps. This is actually about from 2.5 to 3 years ago. We've come a long way, baby, as you noticed this morning. So what we try to do is make sure, especially on the map, that transit stops, for example, embody a certain type of contrast, that roads have a certain type of contrast so that they're distinguishable from the base layer, that links in the left-hand column, as you can see, are distinguishable from non-linked content, and so on and so on. And so what we try to do is, contrast is one of those fundamental principles that we always use. One of the things that's really, really important is that if you've got high contrast colors that are really, really close to each other, like red and green or red and blue, they can often cause a lot of visual dissonance. And so we try to avoid those as much as possible. But in this case, generally speaking, contrast is all about making the information components distinguishable from one another. And here is how much we've transformed from 2.5 years ago to yesterday. This morning you saw something dramatically different, and that's taking things a beautiful step further, where the new Google Maps that you saw this morning are actually even a more toned down version of the map that you see here. And again, here's a map of Bangalore, India from about 2.5 years ago, and you could see how thick and bold the roads were. And all of those thickly stroked roads seem to be the most prominent thing on the map. And we really, really, really toned it down to make sure that there wasn't this huge, colorful assault on the eye. Because it really made things hard to scan and hard to read, because everything seemed to be the same saturation and the same tone. So contrast is fundamentally important. What about repetition? Repetition is an easy one too, and it's quite similarly related to contrast. And that is, if you've got all the different information types that you've got on your page, headings, links, body text, and on the map you've got points of interest, primary roads, secondary roads, neighborhood names. All of those are different information types. If you give one of them a style, make sure that that style is repeated all the way through. Yes, that's common sense, I know that, but it's one of those principles that we always seem to fail. We keep adding exceptions to every rule, and repetition, the foundational principle of repetition, reminds us that we should not keep adding differences or exceptions to these rules. So it's like creating a style sheet, and following it as much as possible. Robin Williams had the argument that too much repetition can be boring, too much repetition can be boring, too much repetition can be boring, too much repetition can be boring. On a map, that repetition is required. It's the style guide, it's the style sheet, it's the visual lexicon that we want to remind users of as they scan a map of Bangalore versus a map of San Francisco versus a map of Sydney, Australia. We want to make sure that they can easily scan the map and and we can, without any effort, they know what a point of interest is versus a different type of landmark versus a road versus a neighborhood. Of all of those different information types that fill the page, we try as much as possible to ensure that that style guide remains intact. Alignment on the map, again, as I said before, is a bit of a problem. Off the map, it's fundamental to creating these rivers that guide the eye through the page. And we don't just position things on the page just arbitrarily. What we actually try to do is follow a grid system, or if in addition to the grid system, trying to make sure that things align with other things. So, buttons being in place, they're not just sort of 2 or 3 or 4 pixels off. It might seem like that 2 or 3 or 4 pixels in dissonance is not that big a deal, but in actual fact, it adds weight or slowness to how we scan a page. And if we keep things aligned, it adds a basic uniformity to the page and a basic unity to the page. And that's why we've got these, rivers of the 40 pixels of white text to the left-hand side of the left-hand panel, and so on. Not last but not least, off a map. Look, I encourage you to go out, look at any of our Google I/O content, whether it's digital or in print. Go out and look at the bus shelters. If you see advertisements in the bus shelters, the positioning of all of those elements, especially in an advertisement, are not arbitrary. Look for those invisible lines. And you'll notice that nothing is as arbitrary or as random as it seems. In this case, I actually tried to create some alignment with the elements of my face in that photograph. And so, again, it's not arbitrary. And what it does, as I said before, is add unity to the page. Proximity is the last bit, and that is all about putting things that are of like importance or like meaning closer to one another, so that we can identify groups of information, so that the eye can scan things. If you're not interested in looking at a bunch of links, then we can immediately scan past that group of 4 links on the left-hand side. If you're interested in photos, wow, it's great that we grouped all of those photos and put them really, really closely together. Yes, it sounds like common sense, but it's one of those principles where if you're trying to decide how to space your information, group the information like elements of information more closely together. And what this does is it shaves those nanoseconds and milliseconds of processing time and scanning time off of your user. So beyond crap, there's other things other than crap, obviously. We have some other general design principles when it comes to maps. If you're putting maps on your site, if you're creating mobile applications and so on, obviously size matters. I had a really, really awesome, sexy slide here, but I had to remove it. Again, it's trying to be adaptive to the devices, thinking about the destination device that you're using. The size of the map fundamentally matters. But in those fluctuations of size, you have to ask yourself, how much information does the user need at any given time? If I have a map on my phone, should I be showing a different type of information than the map that's on my desktop? What can I take away in that smaller amount of real estate? And Dave is going to provide some examples later. On the desktop side, you'll notice at sites like Google Flights, that default map really is quite a lovely stripped-down version of a map. We don't need to show all of the state names on that map. We can just show the slight little nuances of political borders, show the origin and destination, and make that the most prominent thing on the map. And everything else on that map is very, very, very much muted. Again, with the exception of some wonderful little helpful serendipitous destination names. They say, hey, on that budget, I could fly to Billings, or I could fly to Portland, Oregon, or whatever. So we try to really, really strip back the information on that map. And again, try to keep everything above the fold, especially in this case. And above the fold is a reminder to us that position is not just about size, but also about position. So make sure, obviously, that people do not need to scroll down the page. Try to keep everything above the fold. And again, on the mobile side of things, above the fold usually means that it's going to take over the entire screen real estate. But again, it's often in a lot of sites, we notice that that's a consideration that's often overlooked. Not only do size and position matter, but message. A map isn't there just to physically exist. Always, always ask what the primary message of the map is. So this is a stationary map that you see here. I photographed it in Christchurch, New Zealand, as I was approaching the Christchurch Botanical Gardens. And the first thing I wanted to know was, where the heck am I? There are all these different entrances on the map, and I couldn't quite see where I was on that map. That little red thing that you see there in the middle of the map, again, if you do the blur test, that red thing does come out quite prominently, but that was just an information center. But if I can't identify where I am, how am I going to get to the information center? What's also interesting in this case, and this is a trap that I myself have even fallen into when I do a lot of data visualization, is if you've got a lot of data and it doesn't correspond to the message of your map, you really don't need to show it. This map beautifully, beautifully illustrates all of these wonderful trees that, fill the Christchurch Botanic Gardens. They're getting in the way of a fundamental element of the maps, and that is the pathways to see those trees, the pathways to get to the different areas of the Christchurch Botanic Gardens. So, and it's a beautiful map, and they've done a beautiful, beautiful job. But what should the focus of attention be? What is the thesis of the map? It's not just about, here's a part of trees, it's how do I guide my users to those different elements and places in the park. So just because you've got a lot of tree data doesn't mean you have to show it. And this leads to this other principle, which is people don't read a map. I'm not going to go, this is a tree, this is a tree, this is a tree, this is a tree, this is a tree. I'm going to scan the map to find out where I am and find out where I want to go. So optimize your maps for scanning as much as you possibly can. Distinguish the message or the thesis of the map from the base contents of the map. And in this case, really, the pathways should have been much, much, much more prominent. And in making things easy to scan, you'll notice that it's all about taking things away. It's not necessarily deciding what you want to add to the map, but what's the most minimal form of map I need, and what's the fundamental information that I can reintroduce to it. And so David's going to talk about that a little bit more later. And as I outlined earlier, the blur test is a great way of figuring that out. So if your message of the map is, in this case, sightings of Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and Godzilla in the western United States, wow, if I do this blur, those pink markers really, really blend in the map way, way, way too much. They're not the most prominent thing on the map, so let's bring them out. But then if I bring them out, I need to ask myself a few other questions. And that is, if every element could speak for itself, what would it say? I'm a pink marker on a map, I'm a pink marker on a map, I'm a pink marker on a map, I'm a pink marker on a map. But I want it to say, I'm Godzilla on the map, I'm Godzilla on the map, I'm Godzilla on the map. So here's where you've got a great opportunity to change the iconography on the map as well. Markers aren't bad, but maybe adding more information to those markers would be a great idea. Also ask, how loud would that map be talking? If I reduce this zoom of this image, and I was showing most of the continental United States, and I had all of these markers there, those markers would be actually rather large, and they would be like, I'm a bunch of markers. Again, try to test the things out as much as possible at multiple zoom levels. So the blur test and the vocation test are key, and we do this a lot. So make it obvious. What's the map supposed to say? Sightings of Godzilla, Sasquatch, and and Bigfoot. But also ask yourself, what are the outcomes of the map? What do you want users to do with this map? If you want users to drive to these sightings, add the roads. And so here, this doesn't provide any information. it's not even showing the states that these sightings are in. So try to introduce a little bit more information, and a little bit more information, and a little bit more information from a base empty map, essentially. And so Dave will get into that later as well. And what this ends up with is a map that's meaningful, but also so fresh and so clean. So you've removed visual traffic, you've distinguished the meaning of the map from the base map, and it's something that, again, is easy to scan, and something that users will be able to get the information that they need to glean from it. And again, as I said before, test it at multiple zooms and regions. So how do I apply all these rules? Dave.
OK, so I'm going to be talking about two major things that you can be doing as developers with your map to help make your map sell its message so that users can quickly see what you're trying to explain. And these fall into two categories, basically. What are you going to do with the base map to help this, and what are you going to do with the data you put on top? And mostly I'll be focusing on desktop maps in my examples, but this applies across the board, whether you're talking about mobile or desktop or any way you're trying to deliver maps. You have to be asking yourself both of those questions. So when we're talking about the base map, it's really the styled map capability that we introduced a couple of years ago, which gives you the ability to customize the message your map is saying. And so one thing that we allow with the styled maps is you can target specific features of the map. For example, you could target geometries or labels. And in this case, I've decided that my map doesn't actually need the context of maybe road names or anything. I'm really interested in the geometries. So I've targeted the labels, and I've turned them all off on the map. You can actually be more fine-grained in the way you're targeting features and target specific feature types as well as just elements. So if we want a little bit of context for the user, so when they look at it, they know, hey, I'm looking at Sydney, or I'm looking at this specific city or country, then we can turn those specific labels on, the administrative labels. I can turn them back on. Another way that we can help change the message of the map is to reduce the visual noise by making the features on the map less distinctive, less bold. And in this case, I've turned down the weighting on all my roads to 0.8. So the roads themselves are taking up much less space, and they're occupying less of my attention. And when I was explaining that we were turning things on or off, we actually have three separate states of visibility in the Google Maps API. So by default, this is what you get in the standard map, and that's with your road set to visibility on. There's a second state which we call simplified visibility. And in this one, we still have road information, but we've tried to simplify it as much as possible. The geometries are a little simpler. We've stripped out the labels. There are still some important markers. There are still some direction signs. But overall, visually, they're much, much simpler. And then, of course, you can turn off the roads altogether. But as you can probably tell, in this case, that makes this map
useless.
Pretty much useless.
The map is crap, but a different type of crap. Yeah.
So you can turn things on, you can turn things off. That's fantastic. But really, the power of it is when you can start to change the stylistic elements of the map too. So here I've got 5 different maps showing off New York. And in the first one, that's the standard new Google Maps that we're showing off. One of the variables we let you affect is the hue. So you can say, I'd like my map or a specific feature to be colored this way. So I've asked for a red New York. The second variable in the third panel there is saturation. And that lets you either tone down the colors so eventually it would wash out to gray, or if you want the opposite effect and you really want to make something vibrant because that is the message that you're trying to send, then you can scale it right up for bright colors. The fourth panel is showing off lightness, which is where we could either scale the map right out to a white, or at the other extreme, it would scale it, make it completely dark and black. And so this way, again, you can adjust how much contrast is on your map and which elements are standing out or fading away. And the last variable we have is allowing you to invert the lightness. So the dark element, the traditionally dark elements of a Google map become light, and the light elements become dark. And it's not until you combine all those different features that you can really have control over what you want your map to say. So here's an example of all those features. I've chosen a very, very stark palette. And again, this is a map of Sydney. But this is telling a quite different story to the one before. I've emphasized the highways by coloring them red, and I've emphasized the secondary roads by coloring them yellow, and I've removed a lot of the labeling and other geographic information from the map. So if you were looking at this map, it's very clear for you to see how do the roads of Sydney connect together? What are the major arterial roads through Sydney? How would you get around? It doesn't give you much other context, but if in the context of how does the traffic system work, it's the perfect map. Here's another example in New York, where this time we're trying to emphasize how the transit system connects together. And here, pretty much everything has been taken out of the map. It's a very muted palette. There's no labels. But we've turned on transit, and that's brightly colored with its labels. So it's the feature of the map. It's the hero. One rule of thumb, if you're not sure, if you are worried that your map is too busy, is to try to turn everything off and then slowly introduce levels of detail until everything you want your users to be able to do with the map is possible, but none of your information gets in the way. So try turning off all administrative regions or all labeling, all roads. Bring them back up and see at what point your data becomes comfortable. So you've got your base map and you're happy with it. The next thing is how are we going to make the data on that map sing? How are we going to make it tell the story that we're hoping for? So here I have a beautiful map of, anyone want to hazard a guess? Somewhere near Paris. Definitely very French. It's actually, I'm trying to highlight the famous cuisine restaurants of Paris or France. In this case, we have 3 cuisines that we know the French are famous for. That's hamburgers, pizza, and fish. So where in town should I go if I want to get a pizza? Where should I be? And again, of course, this map doesn't give you any information. If there was a legend to the side, you'd spend time scanning between the two, trying to work out where exactly all the pizza restaurants are so you can wander around. A little bit of simple iconography, a little bit of simple coloring, and all of a sudden, I don't need to tell you what the map's about. I don't need to provide a legend. That map says for itself exactly where each of these restaurants are, exactly what type of food I'm likely to find there, and where I should wander tonight if I'm after a pizza, a famous French pizza. Of course, if I was referencing these elements outside my map on the web page itself, I would use the same vocabulary and use the same coloring, the same iconography. But you can see just a simple choice of colors and shapes already has made that map infinitely easier to scan. Here's another example. I'd ask you to guess, but I guess you get the point. This time I'm trying to show where all the large airports are in the States. And instead of using specific coloring or specific types of marker to display information, instead I can use vector symbols to give you a sense of data that goes into another dimension. So here I've placed aeroplanes on the map at each of the major airports in the US, and I've sized that symbol corresponding to how many people board planes in that airport every year. And so straight away, again, I'm talking about airplanes. And you also get a sense of which airports are the most important. It's obvious that Atlanta is by far the largest hub in the US, and then you can see things like LAX and San Francisco standing out. And in terms of code, this isn't an impossible task at all. It's actually quite simple. Really, I started with a vector path that Patrick, beautiful designer that he is, designed for me. And then it was a simple little bit of maths where I took how many passengers went through that airport annually, divided it by the maximum and scaled it, so I had a number between, I think I went between 1/4 and 1 1/4, so I had a good range of sizes. And then as I created the marker, I just gave it that vector path and I told it how large its scale was supposed to be. And it was that simple to add that level of information onto the map. Now sometimes, as Patrick said with the trees, you have beautiful data, but putting it all on the map at once is not going to help your users at all. This is a little screenshot from the Google Hotel Finder, and you can see that well, you can imagine that hotels have a lot of variables associated with them. What star rating are they? What do the users think of them? How costly are they? Are they available right now? Do they have a pool? What brand are they? And if we tried to come up with a language in our icons or our symbols that expressed every single one of those variables, again, we'd have the user scurrying backwards and forwards between a really complicated legend on one side of the map and a complicated map with a lot of information on it, and it would take them a long time to try and decipher what it is they were trying to get out of the map. So sometimes the simplest decision is to not make a decision at all and let the user be the one that drives the experience. So you can target specific hotel groups, prices, star ratings that you're interested in, reduce the data, and then it's very simple for the user to scan that and find what they need.
Takeaways, reminding me of food and Paris and so on. So a few, yeah, good, we're doing very good on time. So a few takeaways. Obviously you saw the presentation this morning on the new Google Maps, and as I said before, it's come a long way, baby. If you're creating your own maps, especially trying to build and visualize your own data, it's amazing to see how much process and how much thought has to go into, our analysis needs to go before you even get to the design. And so this is just a few examples and this is in a previous redesign of maps where we just covered walls upon walls with lots of, and sorry to all the forests and trees out there in the making of this redesign. But it's amazing, if you take stock and you really catalog all of the things that are on a map, it's compelling, it's overwhelming, but you have to take stock of them. And that refers to all the information types I was talking about earlier. And so as you're assembling different types of data, and in this case, we've got like transit icons, municipal transit icons, it's amazing to see what role they play. And again, that role they play is dependent upon the type of map that you're creating. And so as you take stock of those elements and information types, you begin to decide, okay, how prominent should transit be on a map of San Francisco? Or on a map of Prague, or on a map of Sydney, Australia. And so if you want those elements to really, really pop out, if that contributes to the effective meaning of your map, then make those components high contrast. So taking stock of the elements and information types, what it does is it forces you to prioritize what's most important and least important. What should be really, really high contrast on the top of the map, and what should be fundamentally burned into the map in a little bit more subtle or lower contrast. Also take stock of the colors. When we first went through the redesign exercise, I think it was something in the neighborhood, we had like 350 different colors on Google Maps. And it was like, why so many? When the color wheel, even the color wheels that we're showing here don't have 350 colors. But we just had all of these different, slight, subtle variations of graphics and images. And we're like, you know what? In order to help people scan, in order to apply that fundamental principle of repetition, we couldn't have 350 or 360 forms of repetition. Let's have 8 forms of repetition, right? Let's have 8 primary colors on the map, and let's use them as much as possible. And then if we're going to add road labels and things, maybe it'll go up to 16. But again, it's about taking stock of all of the different colors and trying to decide, okay, what's my smallest palette going to be? And try to establish a consistent policy, just like you would establish a very, very strict style sheet in your content. Take stock of the strokes, not the band, but the elements of the map. So there are tons and tons of line segments on a map. And as we build ways of guiding the eye through the map and realizing that those strokes are totally unpredictable, they're going to take different shapes, different directions, how can we fundamentally move forward in a way that's going to work for the entire planet? And in this case, you'll see a map of, I think it's Emmaus, Pennsylvania, on the left in about, I think it was, 2010, another one in 2013, and another one as of this morning. And things have fundamentally changed, and it's all because we're trying to improve the experience, trying to give people the information that they need at any given time, and trying to satisfy those fundamental principles, which are CRAP, right? Contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. Don't forget it. Also remember that maps aren't read. People don't read maps, they scan them. And ask yourself, who is your user? Is it going to be my brother? Is it going to be my sister? Is it going to be me? Is it going to be someone with really, really good eyesight or really, really poor eyesight? And irrespective of that, how are they going to use that map that you stick in front of them? And try to emphasize what that message is. That message of the map is the thesis. It's the focus of attention, and it should be, those design choices you make should be built upon that thesis. But if anything, no matter what the message of the map is and so on, try to minimize that visual traffic. It's amazing to see in eye tracking studies how much the eye pops back and forth on map when you give them certain different levels of stimuli, different colors, and so on. But again, in an effort to avoid all of that testing and so on for you, just do the blur test and you can see where you're headed. And that's about it. So we are 3 minutes ahead of schedule. So if you have any questions, please come up to the mic, and we're happy to answer any of them.
Hey there, my name is Yarian, and I wanted to ask, Dave, you're a JavaScript programmer, correct?
Yes.
I wanted to know if any of these features, like removing the rows or changing the colors, or any of these things are available on Android, and if they're not, is there any plan for that?
At the moment, they're not currently available. We don't have the styled map type in Android yet, but definitely that's something we're interested in. Like, obviously, the styling, as we saw, is a really important way of telling your story. So at the moment, we've focused those on the desktop, but watch this space.
Hi, my name is Mohammed. You guys made a lot of really great points about the map design and the pin, some great tips about the pins.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you had anything to share about call-out design, because I've noticed that you guys have started to move away from the kind of the pop-up call-out, and you're doing something slightly different well, actually very different on the mobile apps and now also on the web. Thanks.
Yeah, so the call-out is an interesting one in that, especially when you're working with small areas of real estate like on mobile, the call-out ends up becoming something that you transition usually laterally from side to side or up and down. And so what's really important in that space is to always provide that tiny little bit of the teaser that says, the call-out is going to happen if you come down in this space or if I swipe across this space. And it's always to provide the before and after. So the before being that little call to action or that little visual indicator that says there's going to be more information beyond here. And as soon as that transition occurs, there's going to be an easy way for me to get back to that original view. So that permanence or prominence of that before and after, that teaser that says, here's my destination and here's my way back is really, really important in that small piece of real estate. As you saw this morning, you'll notice that photos that are added to maps, I believe this morning you may have seen the Basilica in the Vatican City. And you'll notice that we have this new style of callouts which point, so we have an actual grid of information, so a bunch of thumbnails at the bottom of the map, and pointing to the elements on the map, as opposed to having huge info windows that say, hey, this photo exists here, and this photo exists here, and this photo exists here, and this photo exists here. So we've noticed that there's ways of again, following the fundamental principle of proximity, of grouping the information away from it. So take all of those, because photos and thumbnails are actually quite visually rich, taking those photos and actually grouping them together and just providing those annotation lines or call-out lines to that information. And so to me, those are sort of the two fundamental principles or the biggest, most significant changes that we've seen. I think for mobile is probably the more challenging because of the limitations in real estate. But those are two examples anyway of how we've sort of overcome the problem, because you know how prominent our info windows or callouts used to be. We've come a long way, baby. Yes. Yes.
Hi, Patrick, fellow UXer. Appreciate keeping the faith. With respect to the kind of data visualization, the extent to which Maps is becoming a kind of data visualization canvas that's open to kind of receive and render data. you know, they're big, like enterprise data visualization things are just like, throw anything at me, I'll render it. But your point is it works better if you actually kind of curate and think about the message.
Yeah.
And where does that exist in the roadmap tool suite? I know, I understand that it could exist in the raw code, but is that part of the vision for Google Maps, and how it sits with spreadsheets or other kind of data serving platforms?
You've inspired me to create something, because right now, there isn't. I mean, the principle is there. We want to try to offer you as much freedom as possible. We can't ever predict what all of the messages will be, right? And what all the messages are at any given piece of data visualization. The topics are just too uncountable and innumerable. So that said, you've triggered an interesting little project in my mind, my next 20% project, in order to maybe rein in on some of the actual, like, what are the most common sort of pitfalls in showing too much information, and do they fall under a specific category or genre of data visualization? So for example, I mean, I did a lot of work on crisis maps, and what I noticed was, in an effort to provide the most accurate information possible, especially because it usually involved life-threatening situations like tsunamis and fires and so on, the information had to be accurate, therefore it had to show everything. I'm like, well, if all I need to do is get to, you know, I'm trying to get through a flood, and I need to show how severe the floods are, what the height of the water is. The height of the water is important, but is that road impassable given that height of water? And so maybe what we need in those situations, in those genres, is the reminders of, what are you trying to say? You've inspired me. Thank you for that. Yes, so the answer is no, we don't have anything yet, but you've inspired me to do something.
So we're actually over time now, unfortunately. But if you want to come and grab us afterwards, we're more than happy to answer your questions. And thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you.